Summer in Birmingham, Alabama, 1891. The air hung heavy with humidity, clinging to the skin like a desperate lover. The Richardson family had recently moved into their new home on the outskirts of the rapidly growing industrial city, drawn by the promise of wealth from the booming iron industry. Their property, a handsome two-story colonial revival with a sprawling yard, boasted a magnificent weeping willow tree that dominated the landscape. Its cascading branches created a natural sanctuary of shade, a reprieve from the merciless southern heat. Thomas Richardson, a stern but fair man of 42, had made his fortune in coal mining. His wife, Eleanor, 20 years his junior, was known for her beauty and quiet demeanor. Their children, William, 12, and twins Margaret and Elizabeth, 8, were delighted by the expansive grounds, particularly the ancient willow that seemed to beckon them with its swaying tendrils. "This tree must be at least 100 years old," Thomas remarked to Mr. Jenkins, the property's caretaker, as they surveyed the grounds shortly after moving in. Jenkins, a wiry man with eyes like coal, nodded slowly. "Older, sir. Been here since before the war. Some say it was planted when the city was nothing but wilderness." "It's magnificent," Thomas said, admiring its gnarled trunk that measured nearly 6 feet in diameter. Jenkins hesitated before speaking. "The previous owners didn't care much for it, wanted to cut it down, actually." "Cut it down? Why would anyone destroy such a beautiful specimen?" Jenkins shrugged. "Some folks get notions, is all." He paused, then added, "They said their children wouldn't play near it, claimed it made them uneasy." Thomas dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. "Superstitious nonsense. My children haven't stopped playing under it since we arrived." Indeed, the Richardson children had adopted the tree as their outdoor kingdom. William had fashioned a crude swing from rope and a wooden plank, while the twins played endless games of hide-and-seek among its curtain-like branches. Only Eleanor seemed to share Jenkins' reservation about the willow. "There's something peculiar about that tree," she confided to Thomas one evening as they prepared for bed. "Sometimes I feel as though it's watching us." Thomas chuckled, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "My dear, you've been reading too many of those dime novels. It's just a tree, an old one, but a tree nonetheless." Eleanor tried to smile, but her unease remained. "Perhaps you're right." She didn't mention the shadows she sometimes glimpsed from their bedroom window, shadows that moved against the wind, or the faint whispers she heard when passing beneath its branches. Nor did she speak of how the family's hound, Brutus, refused to venture near the willow, hackles raised whenever he was brought too close. The summer progressed, and the Richardsons settled into their new life. Thomas became a respected figure in Birmingham's business community, while Eleanor took to organizing social gatherings that quickly established the family among the city's elite. The children thrived, particularly William, who excelled in his studies at the prestigious Boys' Academy. It was late August when the family commissioned a photographer to take their portrait. These photographs were expensive and time-consuming affairs, but Thomas insisted on commemorating their first summer in their new home. The photographer, a Frenchman named Monsieur Devereux, who had established himself as the preferred portraitist of Birmingham's wealthy, suggested the willow as a backdrop. "The tree, it has character," he declared, gesturing dramatically. "It will frame the family beautifully." The day of the photography session dawned bright and clear. Eleanor arranged everyone in their finest attire, Thomas in a tailored 3-piece suit, herself in a high-necked gown of lavender silk, William in a sailor suit, and the twins in matching white dresses with blue sashes. They positioned themselves beneath the willow as Monsieur Devereux directed, Thomas seated on a chair brought from the parlor, Eleanor standing beside him with one hand on his shoulder, William standing proud to his father's right, and the twins seated on a small blanket at their parents' feet. "Remain very still," Devereux instructed, his head disappearing beneath the black cloth behind his camera. "The exposure takes time. Do not move." The family froze in position, maintaining their smiles despite the sweltering heat. Seconds stretched into minutes as they waited for Devereux to complete his work. It was Elizabeth who first noticed it, a sensation of cool fingers brushing against her neck. She thought it was simply a branch swayed by the breeze, but when she glanced back, there was nothing there. The feeling persisted, however, and goosebumps erupted across her skin despite the heat. "Almost complete," Devereux called. "Just a moment more." Margaret felt it next, not a touch but a whisper, so faint she could barely distinguish words. "Join us." She might have turned, breaking the pose, had her father not fixed her with a warning glance, silently commanding her to remain still. The photograph was completed without incident, and Devereux promised to deliver the finished portrait within the week. As the family walked back to the house, Elizabeth tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, "someone was behind the tree." Eleanor frowned. "Behind the tree? What do you mean, dear?" "While the man was taking our picture, I felt someone touch my neck and I heard—" She hesitated. "Heard what?" "Voices. They said, 'Join us.'" Eleanor's frown deepened. "It was just the wind in the branches, darling. There was no one there." But that night, Eleanor woke to find Elizabeth standing at the window, staring out at the willow tree, its silhouette black against the moonlit sky. "Elizabeth, what are you doing out of bed?" The child didn't turn. "They're calling me, Mama." Eleanor rushed to her daughter, turning her away from the window. Elizabeth's eyes were open but unseeing, her expression blank. She was sleepwalking. Eleanor guided her back to bed, tucking her in beside her twin, but sleep eluded Eleanor for the remainder of the night as she contemplated her daughter's words. The following days passed without incident, and Eleanor began to dismiss her concerns as nerves from the adjustment to their new home. The portrait arrived, packaged carefully in brown paper and string. The family gathered in the parlor as Thomas unwrapped it, eager to see how they had been captured. The portrait was striking, the willow's branches creating a dramatic canopy above them, the family's faces solemn yet dignified in the manner of photographs of the era. But as Eleanor studied it more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Partially hidden behind the massive trunk of the willow, barely visible among the shadows, was a figure. It was indistinct, blurred by the exposure time, but undeniably human-shaped, a dark smudge with what appeared to be a pale face peering out from behind the tree. "Thomas," she whispered, pointing to the anomaly. "Look there." Thomas squinted at the photograph. "It's merely a flaw in the development process," he said dismissively, "or perhaps a trick of the light." "No," Eleanor insisted. "Someone was there. Elizabeth said she felt someone behind the tree." Thomas sighed. "Eleanor, please, don't let your imagination run wild, and don't encourage such fancies in the children." The portrait was hung in the formal dining room, where it drew compliments from visitors, none of whom seemed to notice the shadowy figure lurking behind the tree. But Eleanor couldn't forget it, and she began to watch the willow with growing suspicion. William was the first to fall ill. It began with a fever that the doctor diagnosed as a summer ague, common enough in the humid south. But the fever persisted, and William became delirious, speaking of the tree people who visited him in the night. "They come through the window," he told his mother, his eyes glassy with fever. "They smell like earth and rot, and their fingers are like twigs. They want me to go with them under the ground." Eleanor moved William to a bedroom on the opposite side of the house, away from any view of the willow. His condition improved slightly, but then Margaret began to exhibit similar symptoms. Like William, she spoke of nocturnal visitors who urged her to join them beneath the tree. By October, both twins were bedridden, their once rosy complexions now ashen, their vitality seemingly drained away. The local physician was baffled. "I can find no physical cause for their decline," he admitted to Thomas and Eleanor. "Perhaps a consultation with a specialist in Birmingham would be advisable." Thomas arranged for a prominent physician from the city to examine the children, but his diagnosis was equally inconclusive. "Rest and nourishment," he prescribed, and perhaps a change of air. The countryside might be beneficial. Eleanor was convinced that the willow was somehow responsible for her children's illness. "We must cut it down," she insisted to Thomas. "There's something evil about that tree." Thomas, though worried for his children, remained skeptical of his wife's suspicions. "Eleanor, it's a tree, not a malevolent entity. The children are ill, yes, but trees don't cause sickness." "Then explain the figure in the photograph," Eleanor challenged. "Explain why all three children spoke of people coming from the tree. Explain why they only began to sicken after we took that portrait beneath its branches." Unable to provide a rational explanation and desperate to ease his wife's distress, Thomas finally relented. "Very well, I'll have Jenkins cut it down tomorrow." That night, a violent storm swept through Birmingham. Lightning split the sky and thunder shook the house to its foundations. Eleanor lay awake, listening to the tempest, when a particularly loud crack, different from the thunder, drew her to the window. A bolt of lightning had struck the willow, splitting its massive trunk down the middle and setting it ablaze despite the pouring rain. Thomas joined her at the window. "Good God," he breathed. "The whole thing might come down." They watched as the ancient tree burned, its flames hissing in the downpour, but refusing to be extinguished. By morning, only a charred, smoking stump remained, surrounded by fallen branches and debris. As if by miracle, the children's condition began to improve almost immediately. Within days, William was strong enough to sit up in bed, and the twins' fevers broke. By the end of the week, they were well enough to come downstairs for meals. "See," Thomas said to Eleanor, as they watched the children eating with hearty appetites for the first time in weeks. It was merely a coincidence. They were already on the mend. Eleanor wasn't convinced, but she was too relieved at her children's recovery to argue. She instructed Jenkins to remove the stump and clear away all remnants of the willow, which he did with surprising reluctance. "Some things are best left alone, ma'am," he muttered as he worked. "Disturbing the ground there." "It ain't right." Eleanor dismissed his concerns, but as Jenkins dug around the massive stump, his shovel struck something that wasn't root or stone. Further excavation revealed human bones, not one skeleton, but several, jumbled together in the earth that had nurtured the willow for decades. Word spread quickly, and soon the authorities arrived. The investigation determined that the remains belonged to at least 7 individuals, including children. They were estimated to have been buried at least 30 years prior, possibly during the Civil War. The previous owners mentioned nothing about a burial ground, Thomas insisted to the police inspector. "Not a proper burial ground," the inspector corrected. "These folks weren't laid to rest with any dignity. Looks more like they were disposed of, if you take my meaning." The newspaper reports were sensational. "Mass grave discovered on Richardson property, and willow tree grows from unmarked graves." The stories speculated wildly about the identities of the dead, victims of war atrocities, murdered slaves, or a family killed for their gold and buried where they fell. For weeks, the Richardsons endured the whispers and stares of their neighbors. The children, though physically recovered, remained traumatized by their experiences. They refused to play in the yard, even after the remains were properly interred in the city cemetery. Eleanor insisted on moving, and Thomas, his business reputation tarnished by the grisly discovery, reluctantly agreed. They sold the property at a significant loss to a developer who planned to divide it into smaller lots. Before they left Birmingham for good, Eleanor removed the family portrait from the dining room wall. She intended to destroy it, but something stayed her hand. Instead, she locked it in a trunk along with other mementos from their brief, ill-fated residency. Years later, long after the Richardsons had established a new life in Atlanta, the trunk was opened by a curious William, now a young man of 20. He found the portrait and showed it to his sisters, who had only dim memories of their time in Birmingham. "Look," Elizabeth said, pointing to the shadowy figure behind the tree. There really was someone there. Margaret leaned closer, studying the indistinct shape. "Not someone," she whispered. something. For within the photograph, time and the chemical processes of development had clarified what had once been merely a suggestion of a figure. Now clearly visible were multiple faces peering from behind the willow's trunk. Gaunt, hollow-eyed faces with expressions of infinite hunger and longing, their spectral hands reaching toward the unsuspecting family that had posed before them on that bright summer day. 5 years after the Richardsons departed Birmingham, their former property had been transformed. The developer who purchased it had indeed divided the land, constructing 3 modest homes where once the Grand Colonial had stood. The site of the willow tree, however, remained conspicuously vacant, a circular patch of bare earth where nothing would grow, not grass, nor weed, nor flower. The middle house, built closest to this barren spot, was purchased by the Collins family in the spring of 1896. Samuel Collins, a foreman at the local steel mill, was proud to provide his wife Clara and their 4 children with their first owned home. The property was affordable, likely due to its infamous history, but Samuel was a practical man who dismissed such superstitions. "The dead can't hurt the living," he told Clara when she expressed concern about the property's grim past. "Besides, those remains were removed years ago. There's nothing left but dirt." Clara was less certain. "The children at school already tease our Robert about living in the boneyard," she said. "And that circle where nothing grows, it's unnatural." Samuel sighed. "We'll plant a garden there. With enough care, anything will grow." But the circle defied all of Samuel's efforts. He tilled the soil, mixed in manure and rich compost, planted seeds and even young saplings, but everything withered and died within days. Eventually, he built a small shed over the spot, covering the stubborn earth with wooden planks and using the structure to store his tools. Their oldest son, Robert, aged 13, became fascinated by the property's history. He collected newspaper clippings about the discovery of the remains and sought out anyone who might remember the events. Most were reluctant to discuss it, but Jenkins, the former caretaker who now worked as a groundskeeper at the city cemetery, was willing to share what he knew. "They say this land was once part of a plantation," Jenkins told Robert one afternoon as the boy helped him tend to graves. "The master was a cruel man, especially to his slaves. When the war came, he feared they would rise against him, so he had 7 of them executed. A family it was, parents and 5 children. Had 'em buried right there where your pa's shed stands." "But why did the tree grow there and nowhere else?" Robert asked. Jenkins' expression darkened. "Trees need nourishment, boy. Those bodies fed that willow for decades, and some say the spirits of the dead became one with the tree, that they used it to reach out to the living." Robert shivered despite the warm spring air. "The Richardson children got sick because of the tree, didn't they?" Jenkins nodded slowly. "The tree wanted company. It always wants company." Robert began having dreams, vivid nightmares in which he stood before the shed, watching as the wooden structure sank slowly into the ground, pulled down by gnarled roots that emerged from the earth like skeletal hands. In the dreams, he could hear voices calling from beneath the soil, pleading and threatening in the same breath. He wasn't the only one affected. His younger siblings complained of hearing scratching sounds from beneath the floorboards at night, like fingernails dragging across wood. Clara found herself inexplicably drawn to the shed, sometimes coming to her senses while standing before its door with no memory of having walked there. Only Samuel seemed immune to the property's influence, but even he couldn't ignore the strange occurrences that plagued their home. Tools left in the shed would be found arranged in patterns on the floor. The door, securely latched at night, would be standing open in the morning. Most disturbing were the footprints, small, bare feet that appeared in the dust of the shed floor, always walking in a circle around the center of the structure. "Children from the neighborhood playing pranks," Samuel insisted, though he couldn't explain how they entered the locked shed. As summer approached, Robert's nightmares intensified. In late May, Clara found him sleepwalking, attempting to dig in the earthen floor of the shed with his bare hands, his fingernails torn and bleeding. "They're suffocating," he told her, his eyes open but unseeing. "They can't breathe under the dirt." The incident frightened Clara enough that she insisted Samuel consult a physician. Dr. Howard Miller was new to Birmingham, a young man with modern ideas who had studied in Europe. After examining Robert and hearing the family's experiences, he proposed an unusual diagnosis. "I believe what we're dealing with is a form of shared hysteria," he explained. "Robert has become fixated on the property's history, and his anxiety is manifesting as somnambulism, sleepwalking. The rest of the family, aware of his fears and the land's reputation, are experiencing a form of suggestion that makes them susceptible to imagining supernatural occurrences." "There's nothing imaginary about footprints in the shed," Clara protested. Dr. Miller smiled indulgently. "The mind is powerful, Mrs. Collins. Once primed to expect the paranormal, it can interpret ordinary events, perhaps your own children playing in the shed and forgetting, as something sinister." His recommendation was for Robert to spend the summer with relatives, away from the influence of the property and the stories that had captured his imagination. Samuel agreed, and arrangements were made for Robert to stay with Clara's sister in Mobile. The night before Robert's departure, the family was awakened by a tremendous crash. Samuel rushed outside to find that the shed had collapsed, its walls splintered outward as if pushed from within by an enormous force. In the center of the debris where the bare circle had been, a green shoot had emerged from the soil, a sapling, its leaves unfurling in the moonlight. "It's impossible," Samuel whispered. "Nothing has grown there for years." By morning, the sapling stood 3 feet tall, its growth visible to the naked eye, leaves unfurling and branches extending with unnatural speed. Dr. Miller, summoned by a frantic Clara, was dumbfounded. "Some species of willow can grow rapidly, but nothing like this," he admitted. "It defies scientific explanation." Robert, who had been scheduled to leave for Mobile that day, refused to go. "It's starting again," he told his parents. "The tree is coming back, and it will take us all if we stay." Samuel, his pragmatism finally shaken, contacted the authorities. The city inspector who arrived was the same man who had investigated the discovery of remains 5 years earlier. He took one look at the rapidly growing willow and ordered the property evacuated. "This land should never have been developed," he declared. "Whatever is buried here goes deeper than those 7 bodies we found." The Collins family abandoned their home that day, taking only essential belongings. They found temporary housing with Samuel's brother while deciding their next course of action. The city, meanwhile, cordoned off the property and began a more thorough excavation of the site. What they discovered horrified even the most seasoned investigators. Beneath the surface of the barren circle, far deeper than the previous dig had gone, lay dozens more bodies, layer upon layer of remains, some appearing to date back over a century. Men, women, children, all buried unceremoniously, their bones bearing marks of violence. Historians and archaeologists descended on Birmingham, and a grim history was gradually uncovered. The land had once been the site of a farm owned by Ezekiel Wilkes, a man rumored to have made a fortune through nefarious means. Local records showed that numerous travelers who stayed at his home were never seen again. When suspicions grew too strong, Wilkes would move on, only to return years later under a different name. The most disturbing discovery was a journal found buried with one of the victims, a young woman who had apparently documented her captivity before her death. Her final entry read, "He feeds them to the tree, says it makes it grow strong, says it will protect him as long as it feeds. God help us all." The willow sapling, despite attempts to destroy it, continued to grow at an impossible rate. Within a week, it stood 20 feet tall, its branches beginning to form the characteristic weeping canopy. Workers sent to cut it down reported hearing voices emanating from within the trunk, and several fled the site, refusing to return. Finally, the city resorted to extreme measures. The entire area was doused with kerosene and set ablaze. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming not only the willow, but the remains of the Collins home and the neighboring houses, which had been evacuated as a precaution. When the flames finally died down, nothing remained but ash and scorched earth. The city council voted to convert the property into a memorial park, with a stone marker commemorating the victims found there. The land was to remain undeveloped in perpetuity. Robert Collins never fully recovered from his experiences. Though the family relocated to Tennessee and attempted to put the horrors of Birmingham behind them, he remained haunted by nightmares. He developed an obsessive fear of trees, particularly willows, and would become hysterical if forced to be near one. In 1912, at the age of 29, Robert returned to Birmingham alone. Despite his family's pleas, he was determined to confront his fears. The memorial park, by then a peaceful green space with benches and flower beds, showed no sign of the tragedies that had occurred there. The stone marker stood in the center, surrounded by a circular iron fence. Robert approached it cautiously, heart pounding. The inscription listed the names of those victims who had been identified, with a simple line acknowledging, and many others unknown, victims of cruelty and greed, may they rest in peace at last. As he stood reading the names, a park caretaker approached. "You interested in the history of this place?" the elderly man asked. Robert nodded. "I lived here once as a boy, in one of the houses that used to stand here." The caretaker's eyes widened. "You're one of the Collins children?" "Robert Collins, yes." The man glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "You should know. It's not over." Robert felt his blood turn to ice. "What do you mean?" "The ground here. Nothing would grow for years after the fire. Then about 5 years back, things started to take root again. First grass, then flowers. The city was pleased, thought the soil had finally healed." He pointed to a small garden plot near the stone marker. "But I've worked here since they made it a park, and I see things others don't. That circle there, it's where the willow stood. And look what's growing now." Robert followed his gesture. In the center of the garden, partially hidden by colorful annuals, was a thin green shoot with distinctive elongated leaves. "It always comes back," the caretaker whispered. "No matter what we do, it finds a way. I pull it up. It grows again by morning. I poison it. Another sprouts nearby." Robert stared at the innocent-looking sapling, feeling the old terror rise within him. "Have you told anyone?" The caretaker laughed bitterly. "Who would believe me? They'd say I'm a superstitious old fool. But you know the truth, don't you?" Robert did know. He understood with terrible clarity that the evil that had taken root in this soil would never truly be destroyed. It would continue its cycle, growing, feeding, waiting for new victims. That night, the memorial park burned again. Robert Collins was arrested at the scene, cans of kerosene in his possession, his clothes reeking of smoke and fuel. He offered no defense at his trial, speaking only once to the judge. "It hungered. It would have grown again. I had to stop it." Declared insane, Robert was committed to the Alabama State Hospital for the mentally ill, where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1947 at the age of 64, having never recanted his belief that the willow was sentient and malevolent. The park was restored once more, and a new marker added, warning against the dangers of arson. No one connected the incident to the property's dark history. No one except Jenkins, still alive though ancient, who visited Robert in the asylum just once. "You did right, boy," the old caretaker told him, "but it won't be enough, not nearly enough." And then indeed, in the center of the rebuilt memorial garden, sheltered by ornamental shrubs and brightened by seasonal blooms, a single willow sapling pushed through the soil, reaching for the sun. Birmingham, Alabama, 2023. The Memorial Gardens, as they were now known, had become one of the city's most popular public spaces. Few visitors knew the full history of the land they strolled upon. The stories of mass graves and malevolent trees had faded into urban legend, dismissed by most as macabre folklore from a less enlightened time. The centerpiece of the gardens was a magnificent weeping willow, its sweeping branches creating a natural pavilion where people gathered for picnics, quiet contemplation, or to escape the southern sun. Plaques detailed the park's official history. Established in 1912, renovated in 1948, expanded in 1975, but made no mention of Ezekiel Wilkes, the Richardson family, or Robert Collins. Dr. Amelia Harper, a professor of archaeology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, had stumbled upon the property's true history while researching her book on historical crime scenes in the South. What began as academic curiosity quickly became an obsession as she uncovered newspaper archives, property records, and personal accounts that painted a disturbing picture of the land's past. "The pattern is unmistakable," she explained to her research assistant, Marcus Webb, as they examined documents spread across her office. "Every 30 to 40 years, the willow tree becomes the focal point of inexplicable events. Deaths, disappearances, illness, all connected to that specific location." Marcus, a doctoral candidate with a healthy skepticism, frowned at the timeline she had created. "It could be confirmation bias, Dr. Harper. Once a place gets a reputation for being haunted, people attribute any negative event to the supernatural." Amelia shook her head. "I've accounted for that. These aren't vague connections. They're direct, documented incidents." She pointed to a news clipping from 1983. "Like this one. 3 children fell ill with an undiagnosed wasting disease after a school field trip to the gardens. All 3 reported having touched or played near the willow tree." "Did they die?" Marcus asked. "No. They recovered after being moved to a hospital in Huntsville, away from Birmingham, but their symptoms were identical to those described in the Richardson children in 1891. Marcus remained unconvinced. "Correlation doesn't imply causation. There could be environmental factors, soil contamination, for instance." "I considered that," Amelia said. "The soil has been tested multiple times over the years because of the property's history as a burial site. No contaminants have been found that could explain these illnesses." "Then what's your theory? A cursed tree, vengeful spirits?" Amelia sighed. "I don't know yet, but I believe we're approaching another cycle. If the pattern holds, something will happen soon, centered on that willow." As if to validate her prediction, the local news that week carried a troubling story. A photographer named Daniel Cruz had been conducting a photo shoot for a family in Memorial Gardens. When the developed images were examined, several showed a strange anomaly, what appeared to be faces peering from behind the willow's trunk, though no one had been there during the shoot. Cruz dismissed it as a camera malfunction or a trick of light and shadow, but the family was disturbed enough to contact the parks department. Officials assured them there was nothing to worry about, but privately commissioned an arborist to examine the tree for disease or infestation that might explain the unusual patterns in its bark. Amelia immediately recognized the parallels to the Richardson family photograph from 1891. She contacted Cruz, who reluctantly agreed to meet and share the images. "I've been a professional photographer for 15 years, he told Amelia, as they sat in a coffee shop near the university. "I've never seen anything like this. It's damaged my reputation. People are saying I doctored the photos for publicity." The images were indeed startling. What might have been dismissed as pareidolia, the tendency to perceive faces in random patterns, was too distinct, too deliberate. In one photograph, a child's hand appeared to be reaching toward one of the faces in the tree, though the family insisted the girl had been pointing at a squirrel. "May I keep these copies for my research?" Amelia asked. Cruz nodded. "Take them. I want nothing more to do with them, or that tree." Armed with this new evidence, Amelia decided it was time for fieldwork. Despite Marcus's reservations, they obtained permits to conduct a non-invasive ground survey of the area surrounding the willow. Using ground-penetrating radar, they hoped to determine whether any remains still lay beneath the surface, undiscovered by previous excavations. The results were inconclusive. The radar detected numerous anomalies in the soil composition, but nothing that could be definitively identified as human remains. The most significant finding was the willow's root system, which extended far beyond what was typical for a tree of its size and age. These roots reach at least 100 feet in every direction, the technician explained, showing them the imagery. They've grown around obstacles, through infrastructure, seeking something. Water sources, Marcus suggested. The technician shrugged. Maybe, but they seem to concentrate in areas where historical records indicate burials were found. It's as if they're drawn to specific locations. As their research continued, Amelia began experiencing strange dreams, vivid nightmares in which she stood before the willow, watching as its branches transformed into grasping limbs that pulled struggling figures into its trunk. She would wake gasping, the whispered phrase, "Join us," echoing in her mind. She kept these experiences to herself, aware that they would only reinforce Marcus's skepticism. But when he arrived at her office one morning, looking pale and shaken, she knew something had changed. "I went to the gardens yesterday evening," he admitted. "I wanted to take some additional measurements while the park was quiet. As I was working near the willow, I heard something." "Voices?" Amelia asked quietly. Marcus's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "What did they say?" He swallowed hard. "They said they were hungry, that they had waited so long, that soon they would feed again." He shook his head. "It must have been someone playing a prank. University students, maybe. Did you see anyone?" "No. The voices seemed to come from the tree itself, from inside the trunk." He laughed nervously. "Listen to me. I sound deranged." Amelia shared her own dreams then, and together they reviewed the historical accounts with new understanding. The pattern was becoming clearer. The willow drew energy from human suffering, growing stronger each cycle before something, fire, lightning, human intervention, temporarily destroyed it. But it always returned, its malevolence intact. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Amelia said. "This isn't just an academic exercise anymore. If the cycle is repeating, people could be in danger." Their research led them to an unexpected source, the private papers of Dr. Howard Miller, the physician who had treated Robert Collins in 1896. After his death, his journals had been donated to the university's medical history collection, where they had remained largely unexamined for decades. Miller's early entries reflected his scientific skepticism, dismissing the Collins family's experiences as hysteria and superstition. But as events unfolded, his tone changed dramatically. His final entry about the case, dated June 15, 1896, read, "I can no longer deny what I have witnessed. The willow's growth defies all natural law. I took samples of its tissue for analysis and found cellular structures unlike any known botanical species. It is as if the tree has incorporated human genetic material into its own. A biological impossibility, yet the evidence is irrefutable. What Ezekiel Wilkes created through his barbaric sacrifices was not merely a tree fed by human remains, but a hybrid entity, neither fully plant nor fully human, capable of extending its consciousness through its root system to influence the minds of those nearby. God help us all if it cannot be destroyed completely." Attached to the journal was a sealed envelope containing dried leaves and what appeared to be microscope slides. The university's biology department confirmed Miller's observations. The cellular structure of the samples was indeed anomalous, containing elements that resembled both plant and animal tissue. "This is unprecedented," the department head told them. "If these samples are authentic, they represent a biological impossibility. But they're over a century old. too degraded for definitive analysis. Amelia and Marcus reached the same conclusion. They needed fresh samples from the current willow. Late one evening, they entered the gardens after closing, equipped with collection tools and a portable microscope. The park was eerily silent, the usual urban background noise seeming to fade as they approached the willow. "Do you feel that?" Marcus whispered. "The air is different here." Amelia nodded. There was a heaviness, a sense of expectation that made her skin prickle. The willow's branches hung motionless despite the light breeze that stirred other trees in the gardens. As they collected bark, leaf, and root samples, Amelia felt a growing unease. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, but each time she turned to scan their surroundings, she saw nothing but shadows. "Amelia," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear, "look at the trunk." She turned to see what had alarmed him. The massive trunk of the willow, smooth just moments before, now appeared to be rippling, the bark undulating as if something beneath it was pushing outward. As they watched in horror, the patterns in the wood began to shift, forming shapes that resembled human faces, mouths open in silent screams, eyes hollow and beseeching. "We need to leave," Amelia whispered, backing away slowly. "Now." But as they turned to flee, the ground beneath their feet seemed to come alive. Root tendrils, thin as wire but strong as steel, erupted from the soil, wrapping around their ankles. Marcus fell, crying out as he was dragged toward the base of the tree. Amelia lunged for him, grasping his outstretched hands. For a moment, they were locked in a desperate tug-of-war, with the unseen force pulling him toward the willow. Then, with a strength born of terror, she managed to wrench him free. Together they ran, not stopping until they had reached the park gates, the samples forgotten in their flight. Safely in Amelia's car, they sat trembling, unable to process what they had experienced. "That was," Marcus began. "Real," Amelia finished. "It was real. Everything in the historical accounts, it's all true." The next day, they debated whether to share their experience. Who would believe them? Academic reputations had been destroyed by less fantastic claims. In the end, they decided to continue their research privately while monitoring the willow for further activity. They didn't have to wait long. 3 days after their nightmarish encounter, a 5-year-old boy went missing in Memorial Gardens during a family outing. His parents had turned away for just a moment, and he had vanished. The police organized a search, focusing on the park's pond and wooded areas, but found no trace of the child. Amelia, hearing the news, immediately suspected the willow. She contacted the detective in charge of the case, attempting to explain her theory, but was dismissed as a crackpot. Desperate, she and Marcus returned to the gardens at night, equipped with shovels and a plan to examine the soil around the tree's base. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The ground around the willow was disturbed, with a small depression that could have been made by a child's body being dragged underground. And protruding from the soil were several small items: a toy car, a child's shoe, and most damning, a small bracelet with the missing boy's name engraved on it. This physical evidence was enough to convince the police to expand their search to include the area around the willow. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, and this time the results were unambiguous. A small form was detected beneath the soil, entangled in the tree's roots. The excavation that followed was witnessed by city officials, park administrators, and a horrified public. The boy's body was recovered, seemingly unmarked except for puncture wounds where the tree's roots had penetrated his skin. The medical examiner's preliminary report noted an unusual absence of blood in the body, as if it had been systematically drained. Public outrage led to demands for the willow's removal. Despite objections from historical preservationists who cited the tree's age and significance to the park, city officials ordered it cut down and removed entirely, including its extensive root system. The day of the removal, Amelia and Marcus were present as observers. The work crew approached the task with professional detachment, but their unease was palpable. As the first chainsaw bit into the trunk, a sound emerged that made everyone freeze, a high, keening wail, like dozens of voices crying out in unison. "It's just the wood tension releasing," the foreman insisted, but no one believed him. The sound continued as they worked, occasionally punctuated by what seemed like words, pleading, threatening, indecipherable yet unmistakably human. When the trunk was finally severed, a dark, viscous fluid poured from the cut, not sap, but something thicker, redder. The workers recoiled, dropping their equipment. Several refused to continue, crossing themselves and backing away from the abomination before them. The interior of the trunk revealed a nightmarish anatomy. Instead of rings and heartwood, there were chambers lined with tissue that pulsed and contracted like muscles. The central core contained a column of fibrous material that branched outward, reminiscent of a human spine and nervous system. Dr. Lisa Chen, a biologist called to the scene, was visibly shaken by what she observed. "This isn't a tree," she told Amelia. "At least not entirely. It's some kind of hybrid organism that incorporates elements of both plant and animal biology. I've never seen anything like it. It shouldn't be possible." The removal continued despite the workers' fear, with the entire root system methodically excavated and destroyed. The process took weeks, as the roots had extended far beyond initial estimates, reaching beneath buildings and roads throughout the surrounding area. Most disturbing were the nodes found at intervals along the root system, bulbous growths containing what appeared to be partially digested human remains in various states of decomposition. Some were recent, others had clearly been there for decades, preserved in the tree's ghastly digestive system. Forensic analysis identified remains from multiple missing persons cases dating back to the 1980s, including 3 children who had disappeared from the park in 1983, but whose bodies had never been found. The case files had noted their last known location as being near the willow tree, but no connection had been made at the time. The revelation of these horrors made national headlines. Birmingham became known as the city with the vampire tree, a sensationalist label that nonetheless captured the essential truth of what the willow had been, an organism that sustained itself by consuming human life. As public interest in the case grew, so did information about the land's history. Descendants of both the Richardson and Collins families came forward with family stories that corroborated Amelia's research. Historical societies contributed records that filled in gaps in the timeline. A complete picture emerged of a cyclical horror that had persisted for over 130 years. Amelia and Marcus published their findings in both academic journals and a book that became a bestseller. The Feeding Tree, Birmingham's Century of Horror, detailed not only the willow's biological anomalies, but also the historical and cultural factors that had allowed its evil to persist unrecognized for so long. The memorial gardens were permanently closed, and the land declared a hazardous site. Concrete was poured over the area where the willow had stood, and the surrounding soil was removed to a depth of 30 feet and replaced with clean fill. A simple monument was erected nearby, commemorating the victims and warning of the dangers of forgetting history. For a time, it seemed the nightmare was truly over. Amelia received a prestigious research grant to continue her study of anomalous biological phenomena, while Marcus completed his doctorate and accepted a teaching position at the university. Their experience had transformed them from skeptics to believers in possibilities beyond conventional science. Then, 1 year to the day after the willow's destruction, Amelia received a phone call from the site manager of the former Memorial Gardens. "Dr. Harper," he said, his voice trembling, "I think you should come see this." When she arrived, he led her to the concrete slab that covered the willow's former location. In the center, barely visible but unmistakable, was a hairline crack, and emerging from that crack was a single tender green shoot with distinctive elongated leaves. "It's impossible," the manager whispered. Nothing should be able to grow through solid concrete, especially not after we removed all the soil. Amelia knelt to examine the chute, careful not to touch it. Has anyone else seen this? No. I noticed it during my morning inspection and cordoned off the area immediately. She stood, brushing dust from her knees. Destroy it, burn it, douse the ashes in herbicide and then pour more concrete, and then... She hesitated, knowing how it would sound. Then pray it's enough. The manager nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. And if it comes back again? Amelia thought of Ezekiel Wilkes, who had created this abomination through his terrible sacrifices. She thought of the Richardson family, the Collins family, and all the unnamed victims who had fed the Willow's hunger over generations. She thought of Robert Collins, who had spent his life in an asylum for understanding a truth too terrible to be believed. Then we keep fighting it, she said firmly. We remember the past. We warn the future. And we never ever let people forget what happened here. As they walked away, Amelia glanced back at the tiny green chute reaching for the sun. For a moment she thought she heard a whisper, faint but distinct, carried on the breeze. We wait, we grow, we hunger. She shivered, quickening her pace. The cycle had been interrupted before, only to begin again. The Willow's evil was patient, persistent, perhaps truly immortal. But now, at least, it would not grow unnoticed or unopposed. Its nature was known, its history documented, and in that knowledge lay humanity's best defense against the ancient malevolence that had taken root in Birmingham soil. The battle between human vigilance and the Willow's hunger would continue, perhaps for generations to come. But Amelia took comfort in knowing that future watchmen would be armed with the truth, and with the determination to prevent the feeding tree from ever again reaching its full, terrible maturity. As she drove away from the site, Amelia's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Found something in the archives. Need to talk urgently. The Willow's story, it seemed, was not yet complete. And as long as it persisted, Amelia and those who knew the truth would stand guard against its dark hunger, ensuring that the whispers in the soil would never again grow loud enough to claim innocent lives. In the concrete-covered ground behind her, the tiny green shoot continued its impossible growth, nourished by something far more sinister than sunlight and rain. Beneath the city of Birmingham, in soil stained with century-old blood, ancient roots stirred once more, stretching through darkness toward the promise of future feeding. And somewhere in the space between history and nightmare, the spirits of those consumed by the Willow's hunger watched and waited for the cycle to begin anew.